Please welcome Nora Young.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you to the association for inviting me. Merci beaucoup. I'm really looking forward to the next few days. As you may know, I'll be around here and there over the course of the next few days. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, wherever that room happens to be. The keynotes, panels, and workshops cover different topics and come from a range of perspectives, a broad range. But I think what we all share is a commitment to figuring out how to lead in what we all know is a highly dynamic, chaotic, even environment, especially from the point of view of technological change, not to mention leading in the midst of a global pandemic. A pandemic where, as we've explored a lot this season on my show Spark, organizations are really starkly confronting the need not only to be lean and efficient, but also resilient and sustainable in the face of dramatic, even unpredictable change. So thinking strategically in an environment that's not only complicated, but complex is challenging, sure, but also invigorating. Technological change has revolutionized every industry. Certainly it's revolutionized my industry of journalism and my preferred medium of audio. Your expertise in helping organizations not just to adapt, but to lead is absolutely essential now. I hope my remarks this afternoon can help inform your thinking about your work and your clients going forward. So for the past few years on Spark, but also in my own research, I've been looking at what I'm calling the data boom, which is the explosion of bottom-up data that we're producing about the minutiae of our daily lives. The potential benefits of this data boom are profound, as we're going to explore, but the challenges are also great, certainly for organizations thinking about security, about the ethical use of data, and the expectations of their own clients, customers, and communities. But the challenges are great for society as a whole as well. So I'm going to talk big picture about this data-fueled technological environment that we're heading into. Then I'm going to talk more specifically about challenges and opportunities this new data-rich world presents for organizations and for managers within those organizations. But to start talking about the future, I'm going to jump back nearly 150 years to April 1877. So it's April 1877, a guy named Charles Williams Jr. gets a telephone line installed between his business in Boston and his home. And those were the first two telephones that the Bell Phone Company installed. Now, think about getting this newfangled technological object in your home and business for a second. Suddenly, you have to figure out what to say when you pick the thing up, which you've never had to do before. What you say when you pick that thing up, right? It's not obvious. So people collectively experimented with a number of different options, right? In Italy, for example, people still say pronto when they answer, which means ready. In North America, we experimented with what is wanted, which I don't know, seems a little cold to me, just saying. We also tried out, interestingly, ahoy before we finally settled on hello. Although I think there's a certain charm to people walking around shouting ahoy into their cell phones. It was also considered rude just to call someone up out of the blue, an intrusion into the home. So it wasn't uncommon in the early days of the phone for someone to come by your house in person and ask if they could call you on the phone later. So why am I telling you this stuff about a technology that we all take for granted now? Because technological change isn't just about the gear. Technological change is cultural change, not just for individuals or organizations, but for society as a whole. Collectively, we need to figure out the values, norms, ethics, and expectations that govern a new and revolutionary technology. Metaphorically, are we going to say ahoy or hello? When we look at the changes brought about by the digital revolution, we've certainly passed the kind of first and second wave of changes. We've gone through that exciting wave of innovation and disruption and moved into, I think, what we all see is a difficult period, right? Of broken business models, the global reach and unprecedented power of the tech giants, the disinformation wrought by the disintermediation of mass media, and many, many cat videos. There has been a lot of change, but we've yet to see the full impact of the digital revolution, which is going to roll out over years to come. And that's specifically because of the game-changing power of data and the explosion, the exponential explosion of data that we're starting to see out there. So one way of characterizing our current shift is as the big data era. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this term. As you likely know, it refers to these exceedingly large data sets and the analytics that can be drawn from them. These are data sets that can be messy, unstructured, dynamic, and voluminous and coming at us from many different sources. So to use a real world example of big data, as discussed in Schoenberger and Kupier's book, Big Data, Walmart processes something on the order of 10 million purchases a day, probably more than that now. And they look for correlations in the data so that they can plan and ideally find non-obvious insights from the analytics. And indeed, say Schoenberger and Kukier, Walmart has learned that when a hurricane's coming, people buy Pop-Tarts. They don't need to know why. They don't care why. All they need to do is see the correlation. So when a hurricane's coming, they can move Pop-Tarts to the front of the store. And that's absolutely a useful way to talk about big data and the reason we pay attention to it, because you can sell more Pop-Tarts that way. But when we talk about data this way, even when we use the term big data, we kind of get into the world of abstraction and we're liable to miss the human dimension of it, because most of this data is coming from us and is about us, our individual behaviors, all those individual Pop-Tart purchases. We're actively and passively pumping out more and more data all the time. And if we treat it as a big data abstraction, we risk losing that very human aspect of data. That human dimension helps us keep in mind people's expectations about their own data and what's done with it. So I want to start at the personal individual level and then tie this into the big data picture. So let's take a quick tour and see how the personal level of data creation connects to this big data picture through 6 data trends. And then I'll show you what that means for business. So the first data trend is simply mapping the physical body. I'm sure a lot of people here wear some kind of fitness tracker of some kind, like a Fitbit, or at the very least, you probably know someone who does. So technologies that were once used in medical contexts or for elite athletes are now everyday tools for weekend warriors or people just curious about their bodies, thanks to cheaper electronics, the smartphone app boom, and cheap or free data storage. And as more and more of us get smartphones, data gathering takes off via apps that are seamlessly folded into our ever-present phones. And this is not just a developed world shift as smartphones take off globally. Just to use one stat, by 2025, there will be an estimated 500 million mobile internet users in sub-Saharan Africa. Smartphone penetration there will be at 65%. So as we'll see, we're on the cusp of a global culture where data gathering through our phones will be approaching ubiquity. And of course, that app ecosystem opens the door for all kinds of data collection, as we know. And this raises questions not just about privacy in general, but about differential access to privacy. If you can afford to buy products where the business model is charging people for a physical product, you're getting more robust privacy than if you're using a free or cheap product that relies on targeted ads or selling data. So we can see the practical use for the trend in tracking on our phones in the pandemic with the COVID alert app that the government's come out with, right? That uses Bluetooth and a clever anonymous system to notify people of potential exposure to the virus. So there's the physical tracking going on, but there's also mental tracking. So consider something like MindStrong, which is an app that's used to track mental health. They combine therapy with a human counselor with tracking what you're doing on your phone. It's not the content of what you're doing, but how you're using your phone, the metadata. Are you on your phone in the middle of the night? Have you not left your home for a week? Are you typing or scrolling more slowly? All with the idea of predicting when you might be getting into trouble from the point of view of psychological health and then contacting you preemptively. Recent Canadian research suggests 84% of people dealing with a mental health issue would be willing to use these types of apps, suggesting that when people see a clear benefit, they'll share data, provided they understand the uses it's put to and have confidence that their privacy is protected. So this idea, whether or not we use MindStrong in particular, this idea of using the metadata on your phone for behavioral insight is going to be a very big trend. But of course, it also raises the basic ethical question of what happens when we use data collected for one purpose, which is the functioning of your phone, and use it for another, in this case, diagnosis. The second data trend is tracking your experience of the world around you. Now, this could be anything from customer service reviews on site like TripAdvisor, tracking things like the TV shows and the movies you read, all those photos, videos, and status updates to social media. And while this kind of data is inherently messy and subjective, there's lots of focus on how to extract usable insights from this type of data. For example, using sentiment analysis to make sense of social media posts. And as our online experience becomes increasingly visual, more and more of the data that we share is visual. Just one recent stat for you, 500 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube alone every minute, 500 hours every minute. And that's not even including all the other video sharing platforms. And until recently, all those videos and still images that we're sharing have relied on people tagging the images with relevant data or on the presence of automatically generated metadata like location information. But as image recognition and facial recognition take off, more and more of those visual images will be identified automatically. The third data trend is linking that data to actual physical location. As you've probably noticed, there's incredible activity in the mapping space as more and more of our online activity takes place using mobile devices, and more of the data we're producing is tied to physical locations. Now, from a commercial point of view, there's an obvious marketing advantage to location data, right? But beyond the commercial reasons for wanting to tie online behavior to real physical location, the democratization of map making means we're also encouraged to annotate the world around us. The oldest map in existence is a map of ancient Babylonia from the 6th century BCE. It's on stone and it's still preserved. Map making is this deeply, deeply fundamental part of human culture. So one way we're doing that is through a platform like OpenStreetMap, which is an open source platform that lets users plot maps. It's been used, for example, in Kibera, which is the largest urban slum in Africa. It's in Nairobi. And because it's an informal community, it was largely unmapped, but OpenStreetMap provides the tools for people to literally put themselves on the map. An extraordinary democratization of map making. Beyond this specific use case, though, what we're seeing, though, is this braiding together of the digital layer and the physical layers, tying together. And it's not just happening top down, say with a Google Map, but with bottom up as well. So people share photos or videos on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. You document something you saw and post it to Twitter with a hashtag. You share your running routes on Strava. You, I, and everyone else doing this are essentially creating a corpus of data and annotating the physical world around us digitally. What else is it? After all, if I take a picture of cherry blossoms in my neighborhood park in the spring, post it and label it hashtag Trinity Bellwoods, hashtag cherry blossoms. And of course, while we have a lot of this data, we don't always know what to make of it. Is it telling us what we think it's telling us? Translating data into information is an imperfect process. A funny example of this came up just a couple of weeks ago on Twitter. I was just scrolling through Twitter and I noticed that "Thanks, Doug" was briefly listed as a trending topic on Twitter in Canada. And so I thought immediately, well, I wonder if something happened with Ontario Premier Doug Ford. But then I looked into it and I soon realized it was just a lot of random individual people thanking some guy named Doug who was in their lives for something, right? I mean, there are a lot of people named Doug in Canada, I guess. So the data is not always telling you what you think it's telling you. So I have a little poll. Can we have the poll up, please? Tell me if you do any of the following and check all that apply, right? Track your personal stats, post on social media, use location-based services, collect loyalty card points, or make viral TikTok dance videos. So I'm going to let that roll as you answer, hopefully, while I just carry on. So the fourth data trend is that digital means constant capture, right? When we look at most of these current technologies for gathering and sharing data, we've mostly been talking about things that let you opt in, right? You make a conscious decision to share that photo on Instagram, for instance. But as we go forward, capturing data about ourselves is going to be more complete and more automatic than ever. To use just one example, narrative clip is a little square that you wear that takes a picture every 30 seconds without you even having to decide to do it. It just automatically takes a picture every 30 seconds. You have to tell it not to take a picture, right? And whether or not we all start using that or not, it tells us something interesting about the future, which is where the default goes from opting in to the default being that the data is collected and you need to opt out. So interesting when we look at this trend towards capturing and sharing our data. Almost 70% of people in the poll track personal stats, and I wrote that question, like exercise, sleep, and diet. Many people post to social media and so forth. Not so many people making viral TikTok videos. So we're going into this world where the default is that data is captured about us and our behavior. And that is becoming ever more sort of intimate and personal all the time. So a cutting edge example of this is something called Proteus. It's a pharmaceutical company that makes what they call digital medicine. So what it is on the pill, there's a tiny little chip about the size of a grain of sand on top of every pill. And embedded within that is a sensor that reports to a patch you wear on your lapel and from there to your app that you've taken your medication or other information like your heart rate. And it'll communicate that data with your explicit permission to your doctor that you've taken your medication. And this is kind of an interesting technology, right? Because people not complying with their medication is a huge problem, but it does raise a lot of questions about meaningful consent and about how much control we will have over the capturing and the sharing of our data as we go forward. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to be taking digital pills or attaching a narrative clip to their shirt, but it does show the trend, which is towards this ever more increasing, constant, um, ever more fine-grained and smaller levels of capturing data. And of course, this idea of automatic capture can be uncanny or even creepy, even if we know that it's going on. So for example, it's still creepy to look up Google location history and see that Google knows, well, that I lead a very boring life these days, but in a pre-pandemic context, if I go to my Google location history, it knows where I've been, absolutely everywhere I've been, if I have location services enabled. So when we design services that gather customer data, even if we're doing it with the best intentions, and even if we're doing it to give people services that they actually need and want, we need to be alive to the fact that there's a subjective emotional aspect to our data as well. What we're comfortable revealing in one context, we're not in another. And that can be kind of squishy and hard to predict, which makes it very difficult for firms that are trying to use customer data. Crucially, that's true even when we've given our permission and we know that it's happening. It can still creep us out. So as this data capture becomes more constant and more intimate, we are, of course, taking things from one context and putting them into another in ways that can surprise us or creep us out. So consider the case of an Ohio man arrested for alleged arson and insurance fraud. Part of the evidence against him was that his heart rate data from his pacemaker did not match what he said he was doing at the time of the alleged arson, right? Taking data from one context and putting it into another for another use. Now, we might decide as a society that it's a perfectly legitimate tool for police investigations, but as we're seeing with this case, which is still making its way through the courts, the technology change is outpacing our policy and our governance of what happens to that data. So as you think about how you're using data or how your clients are using data, you have to be thinking about the potential for the data to be used in a context that perhaps you or your clients didn't anticipate. So crucial in the use of these tools, in addition to privacy and ethics, are the questions of reliability of the data. I think we tend to have a lot of faith in our tech tools because they seem to show us in objective terms, by the numbers, the truth. But let's remember that they're not necessarily always accurate. For example, there's the recent case of a Detroit man named Robert Williams, who was misidentified as a shoplifter and wrongfully arrested. Once again, we can think about the cultural dynamic of technological change. These tech tools are not used in a vacuum. In this case, they're used in the context of a policing system where Black men, as Robert Williams is, are disproportionately arrested. So thinking about our faith in these tools and thinking about the cultural context in which we're using these tools. So to continue with our data trends, there's all this data produced about our lives, the Facebook posts, the fitness data, the Google searches, the Pop-Tarts we bought as we waited for the hurricane, and increasingly made through these shrinking devices, our tablets, smartphones, narrative clips, fitness trackers, the pills we take, et cetera. In the aggregate, this amounts to big data of millions, soon billions of users. But there's also our next trend, the Internet of Things, which is another buzzword I'm sure you've heard. As we go forward, we'll start to see more computational power embedded in the world around us. You probably have or rely on some of these things in your life already, like the smart thermostat that you adjust remotely, the smart speaker like Amazon's Alexa, or the GPS-enabled city bus that gives you real-time information or exactly when your bus will arrive. This is behind the buzz about smart homes and smart cities. The more internet connected things you have in your life, the more data is generated and connected. Think about the digital breadcrumbs you leave behind in a typical day. You wake up, choose music on Spotify, choices are logged to serve you similar artists next time. You visit some news websites and they use what you and many other people click on to determine what stories are hot and should be moved to a prominent part of the website, and also what should be pushed out to social media where other people see them. So your choices and other people's choices of what to read are actively shaping what other readers discover. And in the evening, Netflix recommends you movies based on what you've watched in the past and similarity to other viewers' patterns. It will even change the image on the digital cover page, depending on how it thinks you should be target marketed, and on and on. As we go about our daily lives, just using the internet means our behaviors, our tastes and preferences are being gathered and used to customize our experience of the world around us. And as using the internet goes from being something we do on our computers and phones to something that's just constantly ambiently in the environment around you through the Internet of Things, through smart cities, through smart homes, we're again braiding through the physical with the digital. And this is by turns delightful and creepy, depending on who you are and whether that data gathering feels helpful or intrusive. There's now this kind of feedback loop between ourselves and the digital and informational environment we inhabit, not just between us and our technologies, but among our technologies and other humans, as you and other people shape what information you have access to. So there's this deeply social collective aspect to all of this data growth. And as I say, this is the promise of smart cities, that data about how you and other people are interacting with your community will be used to make the city more responsive. And since more than half the world's population live in cities now, and those mega cities are growing all the time, using and generating real-time data to be more environmentally responsive, to prevent giant traffic jams, for example, in these enormous cities of the future, is going to be increasingly important. And our last data trend is AI fueled by data. So later in the conference, we're going to do a deeper dive into issues with artificial intelligence and where you need to be concerned and inviting your clients to be concerned. But I just want to connect the AI piece with this data explosion. Earlier, I mentioned image recognition. For years, image recognition and facial recognition and natural language processing were classic hard problems for AI. Machines were just not very good at making sense of images or what humans were saying or typing, something that we do without even considering it intelligence, right? And that's because the standard artificial intelligence approach was to create a list of rules for a program to follow to realize an image of a cat is a cat. And it wasn't very effective at doing that. But things are turning a corner and quickly. And this is thanks to a different approach to AI called machine learning, research that Canadians have been leaders in. And this too is part of the data boom. Machine learning algorithms are trained on enormous data sets. So at its most basic, instead of giving an algorithm a set of rules about cats, you train it on many, many images of cats. So the availability of that data explosion is improving machine learning, but also the ends that the machine learning is put to involve enormous data sets and looking for patterns and correlations, which can obviously provide us with powerful insight, right? Walmart can do that Pop-Tart thing because it has access to all this data about weather and about purchases and looking for correlations. So we have this amazing feedback loop. Our digital technologies gather data, which is then used to train machine learning, which we use in daily life, which generates more data, which makes the machine learning systems work better. We're increasingly seeing these systems used for real purposes in our real lives, especially where they touch on things like risk, probability, or surprising correlations in great gobs of data. So things like credit scores, or whether your resume gets picked out of the heap for a job interview, or whether images of your cells match a giant database of cellular irregularities. Now, maybe on their own, none of these 6 data trends I'm talking about sounds particularly revolutionary, but when these pieces come together, self-tracking as a cultural phenomenon, mobile technologies like our phones and tablets and our narrative clips and smart pills and all that give us constant access to that data, the ubiquity of maps that tie the data to physical locations, smart objects and internet connected sensors that communicate awareness of their environment, the ability to search all that data through text, image, and audio, and machine learning to pull correlations and predictions out of all that data. So out of all that, we have this very different new informational environment. I call it a data map, this highly fluid, increasingly public, location-based set of information, a digital doppelganger of the world around us. And if we had a revolution in information when it became possible to search things on the internet, what does it mean when it becomes possible to, in effect, search the physical world around us? And while we tend to think of data gathering as simply about serving ads or figuring out credit scores, there's genuine social value in the data that we're generating as well. And I want to take 2 examples in the world right now, very simple examples, but I'm going to use them to make a point. So I'm guessing there are a lot of people watching this who use a GPS in their cars to navigate. So you probably know that the way that works is a satellite pings GPS periodically to find out where the car is, just so it can tell you to turn left in 15 meters or whatever. So with Google's navigation system called Navigate, with your permission, you can choose to share anonymously data about your GPS behavior, right? Because it turns out if you know where somebody's car is now and now and now, that's a pretty good indicator of how quickly the car is traveling, right? And if you know how quickly a car is traveling, then you can tell what the traffic is like, right? So Google anonymously gathers together all that data for their live traffic map feature, where they update historical traffic data with real data about what is going on right now. So that's a good example of what we can do with the data exhaust that gets pumped out in virtue of our just engaging with the digital world around us, right? Nobody's particularly trying to share that data with Google's Navigate. We're just trying to get from point A to point B. But what I want us to think about is what happens when we actively try to harness the cultural trend towards gathering and sharing data, but in the service of something more significant than sharing pictures of our lunch. So I'm wondering if anyone there, if I could see your hands, I would ask for a show of hands, who's heard of Ushahidi? So Ushahidi is Kenyan technology. It's an open source platform that was created in the wake of the post-election violence that happened in Kenya over 10 years ago. And what it did was it let people send text messages reporting episodes of violence, which would then be automatically plotted on an online map as a way of bearing witness to what was happening and also presumably to see where violence might be headed. It was a very successful tool, which required people to do exactly the sort of data gathering and sharing that they do when they take pictures of their food, using tools ready to hand, their phones and text messaging. And since then, this same Ushahidi technology platform has been used for crisis mapping all over the world to monitor elections in India, Lebanon, and Pakistan, to monitor extreme weather events in the US, and many more. And the important thing is this isn't some top-down government program. It was literally the idea of three bloggers, three people who had a great idea. And since then, the platform has been used about 90,000 times, 90,000 separate deployments in crises all over the world. So when you're thinking about talking to the organizations that you are counseling, what are the opportunities for taking advantage of the data that's being generated, perhaps for public benefit, perhaps for some innovative applications? And as I say, Ushahidi was the product of three bloggers, right? Three people with a good idea. You can make a big difference. So as you talk to management of different organizations and the work that you do, what are some of the things to keep in mind and counsel them on? The first is trust and transparency, of course. We've seen that collectively, the culture of this technological shift is that many of us have an appetite to gather our data, and that if we perceive a benefit, we're willing to share that data. But that requires trust and transparency. Is the data being used for anything that customers would be disturbed by if they knew? For example, Vice recently reported just last week that Customs and Border Protection in the US has been buying up commercial location data, the kind of data gathered by all those apps that we love to use, which was collated by a data broker called Ventel. And they've been using that commercial data without a warrant to track US citizens. So if you're dealing with clients who are working with consumer data, what are their ethics for managing customer data and for taking stock of where that data might end up, where it might end up if it's sold to a data broker, for example, especially given that so many users of apps don't actually understand how their data is packaged and sold. So that's one area, trust and transparency. In addition, there are specific concerns to address if we're going to take full advantage of the power of data while protecting privacy and rights. It doesn't mean that the people in the C-suite all need to be data scientists, far from it, but it does mean they need to know how to ask the right questions, especially when they're dealing with outside providers. So one thing to be aware of if you're relying on some of these solutions is the potential of bias in the data. So a famous example in the big data and machine learning circles is the case of Boston potholes. So the city of Boston decided they wanted to crowdsource information about where the potholes were in Boston. So they made a free app available for people to put on their phones. This was quite a number of years ago. And the accelerometers in their phone would register whenever somebody's car went over a pothole because the phone would move up and down, right? And they gathered together the data, and great, they're crowdsourcing, they're doing all this stuff that I said people should be doing. They're, involving the community, they're doing something for the public good. And when they looked at the data, they found that surprisingly, an extraordinary number of potholes were in wealthy neighborhoods in Boston. Why? Because people in wealthy neighborhoods were more likely to be driving cars and were more likely to have smartphones, right? No one's trying to exclude anyone, but nonetheless, the data contained biases. And if you're not clear on that, in this case, it was obvious that there was a problem, but that may not be always the case that that bias in the data is clear. So people, especially when they're going to third-party providers, need to talk about bias in the data. Data sets are by definition not capturing all of reality, so we need to be mindful of that, and especially when we're using machine learning. Understanding how to ask questions about where those data sets are coming from becomes crucial. We also need to think critically about the potential tyranny of data-driven algorithms and the ends that we put them to. We've clearly seen the limitations of algorithms when it comes to the news that people get on Facebook. Surprise, surprise, who would have thought that the stuff that people react to is not necessarily a good indicator of what is good quality news, but we may also be reaching the limits of our ability to understand the conclusions that algorithms are reaching, in particular when it comes to these machine learning algorithms of the kind I was talking about earlier, the kind that are trained on these very large data sets. The algorithms these AI systems come up with out of the training data may not be understood by the programmers themselves. So this is a very serious question about how we can understand whether these algorithms are producing bias, whether they're producing problematic results, if we can't actually understand the results that they're giving us, if we have to take it on faith that this is how you should act on the data that you're receiving. However, I would say I was at an event put on by the Vector Institute, which is affiliated with the University of Toronto with funding by Google. And the necessity of, as much as possible, making learning algorithms more transparent, more queryable was listed as one of the top priorities. So the good news is that very, very smart people understand this is a problem and they're actively working on it. Another issue with machine learning algorithms beyond the accuracy of data sets is that we run the risk of giving them a lot of power. And is that something we want to do? Is that something that it's always ethical to do? For instance, I often hear from listeners, and maybe you hear this from your kids or whatever, who say, why do I care about my privacy if I'm not doing anything wrong? But the point is that you don't have to be doing anything wrong to be caught in this kind of algorithmic trap, right? The algorithms that we rely on, these machine learning algorithms, are driven by pattern recognition and correlation. So if it happens that people who wear red shirts and go to virtual conferences on Tuesdays statistically have a higher correlation of a behavior, there you go. A particularly telling example of this was in Frank Pasquale's last book, The Black Box Society. He told the story of a woman who had gone to couples counseling with her partner. And afterwards, she saw that her credit rating took a real beating and she couldn't figure it out because she still had the same job. Nothing had really changed in her life. And once she investigated it, she realized the issue was that she was putting the couples counseling on her credit card. And getting a divorce is correlated with a worse financial outcome and a worse credit rating, right? So, but his point is, Frank Pasquale's point is, this woman was not doing anything wrong. She was doing something right. So what are the contexts in which we want to be able to ethically use these kinds of correlation finding and machine learning algorithms to make decisions? Data security is another issue, obviously. This big data world with so many sources of messy data is going to be spammy and kind of chaotic. The Internet of Things has already meant that people's internet-connected video cameras and tea kettles are becoming part of giant botnets. The use of these Internet of Things enabled technologies are going to produce lots of data, but also lots of potentially quite chaotic data. But beyond data security within your own organization and those you consult, whenever there's a data breach, it affects the culture of security. I don't know about you, but every time I hear about a data breach, it makes me think twice about who I give my data to, not only the company that had the breach, but just in general. So let's do another quick poll. Can we bring up the poll? When you compare your concerns about your own data security to last year, are you feeling more concerned, less concerned, or about the same? I know how I am going to answer that. I am feeling more concerned. And I'm seeing in the chat that lots of people are answering more concerned. And I think that's pretty generally reflective of how we all feel. Privacy, of course, is another big thing for organizations. And there are lots of core issues with respect to digital and privacy and security. But one feature of privacy that I think hasn't got as much attention as it should is what happens when we start to have hundreds or thousands of data points and data sets about us, combined with the way digital technology makes it easy for us to take things from one context and put them into another. Think back to the case of the Ohio man charged with alleged arson and fraud. And just looking at the poll, yeah, I am not surprised with this at all. The vast majority of people are more concerned about their own data security than just last year. So that's interesting. 73/4 of people. So if you think about our privacy rules, most of our privacy rules, even from a legal perspective, were created at a time when protecting personal data meant protecting a small number of very important pieces of information, right? If you're as old as I am, you think about it being things like your credit card number, your social insurance number, your date of birth, right? That's the important thing to protect. But we need to get our heads around privacy in an age of many, many individually trivial, but collectively important data sets, especially as we move into this data-rich, smart cities, Internet of Things world, where there's so many potential data points about us. So that's a little bit of the scary stuff. But on the more positive side, I want to conclude by talking about some of the opportunities for organizations in this data boom. So to return to the Google Live traffic and Ushahidi examples I talked about earlier, what they show us is what happens when we think of data as an opportunity for partnership with people. Can we, for example, share some data to improve goodwill and to improve the customer experience? But more than that, to support shared community values such as sustainability and safety. In short, what would the equivalent of a Google Live traffic or an Ushahidi look like in your world or in the worlds of your clients? And that's going to be different for every type of industry and for every type of organization. But I think it's an important question to answer. And in case you think I'm just being touchy-feely about all of this, there's a large study by McKinsey, which, as you know, is the giant management consulting firm, called Smart Cities: Digital Solutions for a More Livable Future. It came out in June 2018. It's worth bearing in mind. They write, quote, "Smart cities need to focus on improving outcomes for residents and enlisting their active participation in shaping the places they call home." McKinsey's report points out that thinking about, in this case, the smart city, but I think it's applicable to the big data boom in general, it's gone from being just about infrastructure and sustainability to thinking about data as a public-facing good that people can make use of. So thinking of how a public armed with, in this case, smartphones can make use of real-time data to make better decisions in their lives. And I think that's true. But beyond the idea that individuals making smart decisions end up making things better for everyone, I also think there's the potential to think more creatively about how we can harness people's participation so they're more fully participating as citizens along the lines of an Ushahidi. A final opportunity is to think about how client expectations are starting to change and how the organizations you consult, clients or end users, how their expectations are starting to change, and how the context, the cultural context of data is changing as we realize we're building a whole culture and economy on data, and how organizations can be on the right side of history with respect to data, right? Remember, going back to the phone, we talked about the big cultural conversation that happens in the beginning of a new technology coming on board. And the cultural context is changing and changing and changing, especially in the early going. And things are shifting, right? The regulatory environment around data is changing as people realize the consequences of the misuse of their data, which I think most of us didn't realize, right? And now we are all becoming, as we saw in the poll, more concerned about our data than we were even a year ago. So we have the European Union coming out with the GDPR to try and govern how data is used. Post-Cambridge Analytica, there's increasing skepticism about the trustworthiness of social media and the so-called FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, Silicon Valley big tech. There's open talk about breaking up Facebook. Just this past week, the US government Department of Justice launched an antitrust suit against Google. In the short to medium term, this heightened concern about data means that, in particular, organizations that work with algorithms where there may be negative consequences for people, such as finance and insurance, are likely to find themselves under the microscope around these issues. Responding with transparency, as I'm sure you counsel your clients, is paramount. More broadly, though, I think the sea change in how we think about the ethics for data is an opportunity for ethical businesses in general and for Canadian businesses in particular. We already live in a more regulated, privacy respecting environment with regards to data than our US neighbors. There's a great opportunity for being on the right side of this, for being a trusted steward of people's data. The data boom is not going to go away. It's way too powerful. What will probably go away is the Wild West that we've experienced in the last decade. There probably will be a much tighter regulatory environment. There are technical challenges, there are privacy challenges, but I truly believe that if we get the technology right and we get the privacy right, we can do amazing things. In the last 10 years, the digital revolution has refashioned the whole idea of what we consider valuable information, who we consider an authority, and how we get our information, all in less than 10 years. The data boom revolution is going to be at least as profound. I look forward to seeing how you lead that change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nora.
Thanks.
It's Craig back
Hi, Craig.
here, collecting questions from the Whova Q&A sessions and
Fantastic.
from the Whova chat and from the Zoom chat, from Trevor Shaw. Great presentation, Nora. Philosophical level. Have you sat back and considered whether or not humankind is benefited by data boom revolution? Are our lives really better? By what means do we gauge and who really benefits?
Yeah. This is a really important question. I mean, I have to say, even since I set off in this journey when I wrote my book, and the book came out in 2012. And at the time, I was very optimistic about the power of this data to improve our lives. And I still believe that. But I think we are seeing so many of the negative downsides that have to be reined in. We see it in our personal lives, right? I mean, we see it in the problem of our compulsive use of our devices, right? And we see it in the collective level too, in the way that some of these machine learning algorithms are being used in ways that are not beneficial to people, in ways that are discriminatory even. So I'm more alive to the downsides than I was. I think, to your point about what the metrics we use are, I think one important metric is like, just, are we making lives better, right? Are we making our cities more sustainable and more responsive by using some of these tools? Are we providing better service to our customers by using this data, right? I mean, there are certain ways, even in my own organization in journalism, the use of that kind of data lets us target content to people that they may be more interested in. That's a good thing. But are we doing it at the expense of news articles that they ought to be seeing, whether they think they should be seeing them or not, right? There are a lot of questions. And I think we're just at the beginning of exploring, again, that cultural side, right? The ethical side of this whole thing. So my answer is a very wishy-washy, yes, it's good, and no, it's not good at the same time. Thank you for that question.
I guess it's quite difficult to say who it benefits. John Gardner has a question. What security controls exist to protect my privacy?
I think at a personal level, I would say, you know, as much as people can be critical of Google, they are pretty good at some of the transparency things. So looking for things that with Google, like at who does Google think I am, right? Does Google think that I am a man because I look at technology stories? What does it think? So Google actually has a suite of tools that will show you what it thinks it knows about you, and will give you some more granular tools to control what you're doing. That's one thing on a personal level. I think the location data is very problematic. We can see where it's very helpful sometimes. Obviously, if you're trying to get from point A to point B, location tools are very important. But I guess a lot of people turn off location awareness when I don't explicitly need it. I look at the settings for my apps, and I deny as many permissions as I possibly can. I regularly go through the apps and think, you know, I downloaded that in a moment of weakness. I'm not actually a bird watcher. I don't actually need that app, so I get rid of them, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that level of hygiene that we can do. But I think, you know, the bigger point really is it's not really, in some ways it serves these large Silicon Valley companies' interests to say, oh, you have control over your privacy. But it serves their interest because it's putting the weight of controlling privacy on me, Nora Young, against the smartest engineers in the world, right? And one of the world's largest corporations. So what we need really is rules around what can be done with our data that are more stringent and more thoroughly applied. And as I suggested with the US Department of Justice Google antitrust suit, I think we are heading down that road towards more regulation where it's not just up to Craig or Nora to manage their own privacy. Heaven help you if you're relying on me to manage your privacy.
Well, obviously, you know, corporations and people with more money and more sophistication and intelligent teams behind them are going to try to stay ahead of most of us who are on the consumer side of that data collection. But I think the more we can talk about it and share it as a community, we start to realize where we can protect ourselves and help to also be involved in shaping those regulations so that
absolutely
they are not limited in a capacity that restricts us and our businesses that might benefit from having some of that intelligence.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a balancing act.
Yeah. From Angela Champ, is it possible to do work in today's reality without giving up a large portion of our personal data and privacy?
That's a great question, as we are now essentially have screens attached to us at all times with the pandemic. I think the good side of that, I think, is that if we have competition amongst some of these platforms, I mean, if you look, for example, about the video conferencing boom that's happened in the pandemic, if we have competition in that space where you have like Zoom in competition against Google Meet and against some of these other platforms as well, you stand a greater chance to have more robust privacy because there's scrutiny over these kinds of things and increasing scrutiny over these kinds of things. But it certainly is true that there is a digital layer increasingly between us and everything that we do. And to an extent, you're always going to be giving up some of your privacy. For me, it's a question of asking, what is the benefit I get out of this versus, you know, what are the costs to my privacy, right? So Shoppers Drug Mart knows a lot about me and Loblaws knows a lot about me because it has all the shopping data about me, but I get benefit from that. I get free groceries or free points or whatever. So it's that balancing act of saying, what am I actually getting out of this versus what I'm giving up? But I think it's increasingly, it's hard. How can you not use Google? How can you not use Google? How can you, even if you say, I'm not going to shop at Amazon, their cloud services provide, you know, they power the underlayer of some of the biggest technology companies in the world, right? So opting out of it is also not an entirely effective strategy. So, yeah.
And, you know, the health issues, though, today are I think, quite high on everybody's minds. And these health apps, you mentioned one of them, you know, they're telling us how we're doing and different physical activities and mental activities. How do you see these impacting people as we go forward, and how do we make sure that they're not discouraging us or depressing people versus encouraging them?
Yeah, I think, you know, the design of these things is, from a personal point of view, the design of these things is crucial. There's a guy out of Stanford, I believe, named BJ Fogg, who talks about persuasive technologies, right? So how do you design a technology, especially for something like health and fitness, that motivates you and that doesn't depress you or doesn't make you so neurotic that you're doing laps around your kitchen table at 11:55 at night to get your points, right? So there's the design question. I think and this is, I would say, an example, health is an example of the potential value of this kind of data, right? The hope is that if we have a lot of data about people, that we're not only improving individual people's outcomes, right? If you have a lot of data about, for example, your blood sugar level, right? That's going to help you as an individual. But the hope is that in the aggregate, that kind of data can be more generally helpful and can help improve health outcomes for everybody. So health, I think, is a really crucial area where we actually see both the privacy risks and you know, the emotional risks of using these technologies, but where we also see the potential benefits. The good thing is that the health sector is very protected by privacy regulations, right? And devices that are used in a health context are quite well regulated both here and in the United States. So I would say that we are in a better position to take advantage of those health apps. But sometimes, I mean, I would just say as a personal anecdote, I had a Fitbit, I used it, I got benefit out of it. It helped me see some insights. But at a certain point, I thought, this this doesn't feel totally healthy to me that I keep checking how many steps I'm doing all the time. So, I put it aside for the most part, and I use it when I'm in a situation like a pandemic and I'm realizing I'm not leaving my house enough. I need to motivate myself by putting on my Fitbit, or if I want to reach a particular fitness goal, but I try and do it in moderation.
Moderation's a good word. I've got a few more questions here. We're down to a couple more minutes, and then we'll be heading on. And thanks again, Nora, for that. There's been a couple of questions about companies that have their databases breached and don't tell people until it makes the news. So how do we protect ourselves from that going forward?
Yeah. It's a really good point. I mean, I think from the point of view of businesses, I'm not a security expert and I'm not in the corporate sector, but I think that, if you're not transparent about it, you not only run the risk of damaging your reputation by the initial data breach, but then damaging it on top when it comes out that you knew about this for a very long time and didn't do anything about it. So from an entirely practical point of view, I think there's good reason to be transparent and to respond as quickly as you can once you know the facts of the case. I think the reality is that this is just a reality of life, right? It's like the weather. We can do the very best we can around data security and data privacy, but it's going to happen. It is going to happen. And from our consumer point of view, the only thing we can really do to protect ourselves are all those good things about like changing your password, using different passwords for every different, this is stuff we all know. It's hard to do because it's boring and it's tedious, but those are the kind of things that are going to help mitigate the results of a data breach in our own personal lives. But yeah, I think at the corporate level, it really is about that transparency piece for entirely practical reasons, if for no other reason, right?
Yeah, okay. One last question here, and this one came in early on. What are the most promising AI business applications based on deep reinforcement learning?
Oh, that is a great question. As I am neither a deep reinforcement learning expert, nor am I an expert in business. I think that is a very good question. I think that we have somebody who's going to do, is it tomorrow that we're doing the challenges of AI, or Thursday?
It's coming
Tomorrow or
up this
Thursday?
week.
We have a more of a deep dive focus thing on the challenges and opportunities of artificial intelligence. He may be a better person, I think, to talk about it than I would be. So I, with respect, kick that can down the road to my colleague.
Okay, thank you very much, Nora. Thank you all for attending. We'll see you soon.